In March 1917, the most powerful dynasty on Earth had ruled Russia for 304 years. 16 months later, its last emperor, his wife, and their 5 children were dead in a basement in Yekaterinburg. This is the complete story of how it happened, from the first bread riots in Petrograd to the final night in the Urals. 3 films, 1 continuous collapse. 489 days that ended an empire.
February 1917, Petrograd. On the Vyborg side, the streets are exploding. Bread shortages have finally pushed the people to the brink. From the windows of his embassy, a witness watches a mob on the Litani Bridge overturn a tram. They are building a barricade. Gendarmes charge into the crowd. Chaos is everywhere. The great Russian artist Alexander Benoit watches in horror as a mob loots a confectionery on Kamenostrovsky Avenue. Amidst the violence, he sees a well-dressed young man walking with a girl, calmly carrying 4 fresh loaves of bread under his arm. On the rooftops, machine guns are being positioned. The secret police are preparing for a massacre. And yet, just a few blocks away, the halls of the conservatory are filled with music. The great composer Sergei Prokofiev is deep in rehearsal. For a moment, the city outside is forgotten. For decades, the world has focused on the Great October Revolution, but the real earthquake, the event that ended the 300-year rule of the Romanovs and buried the Russian monarchy, happened here in the freezing streets of February. It was a collapse that could have been avoided. It was a tragedy defined by a single phrase: too little, too late. For 50 years, the Romanovs had been lagging behind history. Too late to end serfdom, too late for land reform, too late to grant a parliament. How did the House of Romanov vanish in just 72 hours? Today, we analyze the final desperate days of an empire. Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to explore the turning points of history. This is the February Revolution. To truly understand why the Russian Empire collapsed in a single week, one must look closely at the man standing at the center of the storm. Nicholas II was not a monster, nor was he a tyrant in the way history usually defines them. He was a soft-spoken family man, a devoted husband, and a father who found more peace in the quiet nurseries of Tsarskoye Selo than in the grand council rooms of the Winter Palace. He was a man of the 19th century, deeply religious and profoundly fatalistic, thrust into the violent, industrial, and radical machinery of the 20th century. His personal virtues, his kindness to his children, and his loyalty to his wife became, in the brutal arena of high politics, his nation's greatest curse. The tragedy of the Romanovs can be distilled into 4 haunting words: too little, too late. This was not merely the failure of one man. It was a systemic paralysis that gripped the entire dynasty for over 50 years. Since the middle of the 19th century, Russia had been a nation in a state of silent, desperate screaming for change. While Western Europe and America were racing towards modern industrialization, democratic representation, and the rise of the middle class, the Russian monarchy was trying to hold back the tide of time itself. If we look back at the history of the late Romanovs, we see a devastating and repetitive pattern of missed opportunities. In 1861, the great reformer Alexander II abolished serfdom, freeing millions of peasants from what was essentially slavery. But the reform arrived decades after the rest of the world had moved on, and it left the peasants with freedom but no land, creating a hunger that would burn for generations. Every step Nicholas II took
was a shadow of his ancestors' failures. Land reforms, the granting of national rights, the easing of the heavy hand of censorship, every single one of these concessions was made only when the pressure of the streets became unbearable. By the time the Tsar finally put his pen to paper, the reforms were no longer seen as gifts from a benevolent father, but as crumbs thrown to a starving mob. And for a starving mob, crumbs are never enough. Consider the pivotal year of 1905, the first major crack in the foundation of the empire. When the Russian people marched to his palace demanding a voice in their own government, he resisted until the last possible second. When he finally granted the State Duma, Russia's first parliament, it was a moment of immense potential. Had he done this in 1903, he might have been remembered as the father of Russian democracy. But by 1905, after the blood of Bloody Sunday had already stained the snow, it was seen as a desperate bribe. Nicholas never grasped the importance of timing. He viewed every political concession as a personal defeat, a sacred divine oath he had taken at his coronation to preserve the autocracy for his son. Nicholas II was a ruler who believed he was living in the 17th century. He was a disastrous administrator, a manager who lacked the ability to build a competent team. He was suspicious of strong, talented men like Stolypin or Witta, preferring the company of mediocre yes-men who wouldn't challenge his worldview. He viewed the complex art of modern politics as something dirty, something beneath his station as the anointed of God. He didn't understand that in a modern superpower, the ruler must be the chief executive, not just a spiritual icon. He had no grasp of how to manipulate public opinion or how to build a stable, modern government structure. Instead, the Tsar lived in a carefully constructed spiritual bubble. Encouraged by his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, and a strange circle of mystics and charlatans, he retreated into a dream. He was convinced that there was a mystical, ancient, and unbreakable bond between the Tsar and the muzhik, the simple Russian peasant. He believed the intellectuals in the cafes, the angry workers in the factories, and the shouting politicians in the Duma were just a thin artificial layer of society that didn't represent the real Russia. He was certain that the millions of silent peasants in the deep heartland of the empire loved him with a fanatical devotion and would never allow his throne to fall. This delusion was more than just a personal mistake. It was a death sentence for the country. While the Tsar spent his afternoons on long walks, hunting trips, or reviewing military parades that looked beautiful but meant nothing on a modern battlefield, his empire was rotting from the center. He committed catastrophic errors in his cabinet appointments. In the final months of the monarchy, he engaged in what historians call ministerial leapfrog. He shuffled ministers like playing cards, changing heads of government and heads of internal affairs every few months. No one stayed in power long enough to learn the job, let alone fix the crumbling economy or the failing supply lines. By the winter of 1916, Nicholas II had achieved the impossible. He had alienated every single pillar of his support. His cousins and uncles, the powerful Grand Dukes of the Romanov family, begged him to change course. They saw the revolution coming and pleaded with him to grant a government of public confidence. His own mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, warned him that he was losing the people. But Nicholas remained deaf to the world. He retreated deeper into his family life, believing that God would protect Russia because he was Russia's father. He failed to understand that by 1917, the people no longer wanted a father. They wanted a leader who could provide bread, and they wanted a government that could win a war. The crown was heavy, but the man wearing it had become a ghost in his own palace. To understand the suddenness of the fall, one must first understand the height from which the empire crashed. In the year 1913, As the Romanovs celebrated 300 years of their dynasty, the Russian Empire appeared to be a rising titan on the global stage. It was the peak of their economic power. Industrial production was skyrocketing. Foreign capital, mostly from France and Britain, was pouring into the country, and the vast Russian steppe was producing so much grain that it fed half of Europe. On paper, Russia was the great white hope of the 20th century. New steel plants in the Donbass and coal mines in Siberia were fueling a miracle. But this miracle was built on brittle bones. Beneath the polished surface of ministerial reports and grand anniversary balls, the nation was already in a state of simmering, hidden civil war. The revolution of 1917 did not spring from a vacuum. Its seeds were planted years before. In early 1914, while the elite were discussing art and philosophy, St. Petersburg was paralyzed by massive labor strikes. Nearly 1.5 million workers were on the streets, overturning trams and clashing with police. The social fabric was fraying at the edges. But then a massive global explosion delayed the inevitable, the outbreak of the First World War. August 1914 brought a temporary, miraculous unity to the Tsar. For a brief moment, the anger of the factories was replaced by a wave of fanatical religious patriotism. Thousands of people who had been cursing the Tsar's name just days before now stood on their knees in the square before the Winter Palace, weeping as they sang, "God Save the Tsar." They truly believed they would crush the German Kaiser in 6 short months and march triumphantly into Berlin. To the common man, this was a holy crusade to protect their Slavic brothers and the Holy Orthodox faith. For Nicholas II, it was the ultimate proof that his people truly loved him. But the honeymoon of 1914 was short-lived. By 1915, the Great War had turned into a relentless industrial-scale slaughterhouse. Russia's army was immense and incredibly brave, but its leadership was a relic of a bygone era. The Great Retreat of 1915 saw Russian forces pushed back hundreds of miles, losing Poland and the Baltic states. More devastating than the loss of land was the loss of confidence. The front lines began to suffer from a catastrophic shell famine. Russian artillery batteries stood silent while German shells rained down on them simply because there were no munitions to fire back. Soldiers were sometimes sent into the trenches without rifles, told to wait for their comrades to die so they could take theirs. By 1916, the war had exposed the fatal structural weakness of the empire, its infrastructure. The vast railway network, which had been the pride of the 1913 industrial reports, had become a chaotic, tangled mess. The Trans-Siberian and other major lines were overwhelmed. The tracks were clogged with millions of soldiers and endless crates of shells moving toward the front, while hospital trains filled with the mutilated and the dying crawled back toward the cities. But as the army consumed the nation's resources, the internal life of the country began to stop. The economic crisis was not caused by a lack of food. Russia was still a land of plenty. The problem was a total collapse of distribution. In the fertile south, mountains of grain were rotting in warehouses because there were no railway cars to move them north. In the cities, the ruble was losing its value so fast that peasants refused to sell their crops for paper money that bought nothing. They began to hoard their grain, waiting for better times. In Petrograd, the imperial capital, a new and terrifying phenomenon appeared: the tails. These were mile-long queues of women, children, and the elderly standing for 15 or 20 hours at a time in the sub-zero Russian winter. They were waiting for a single loaf of gray bread or a bag of coal that often never arrived. By 1916, the temperature in many apartments dropped to near freezing because wood and coal couldn't be delivered. The city was dark, cold, and hungry. And yet, if you walked into the center of the city, into the luxury hotels like the Astoria or the Grand Theaters, you would find a different world entirely. The aristocracy and the nouveau riche war profiteers were still drinking French champagne, attending the ballet, and throwing lavish parties. The contrast was obscene. Wounded soldiers returning from the mud of the trenches walked past brightly lit restaurants where the elite laughed and gambled. This social divide became a poison. The rear, as the cities were called, became a breeding ground for refugees, desperate peasants, and thousands of deserters who had simply walked away from the horror of the front. They brought with them stories of incompetence, of generals who didn't care for their men, and of dark forces ruling the palace. The patriotism of 1914 had frozen into a cold, bitter resentment. The people weren't just hungry for bread anymore. They were hungry for a target to blame. The Great War had stripped away the last remnants of the Tsar's prestige, leaving behind a nation that felt it was being led to its death by a government that couldn't even manage a railway station. The ghost of hunger was now haunting every street corner, and it was only a matter of time before it found its way to the palace gates. No revolution in history has ever succeeded through the anger of the streets alone. For a 300-year-old monarchy to fall, the pillars that support the throne, the aristocracy, the high command of the army, and the political elite must first crumble from within. By the end of 1916, the Russian Empire was not just suffering from a war, it was suffering from a profound moral and political rot. Nicholas II was no longer a ruler in the eyes of his peers. He was a man lost in a fog, guided by a shadow that the rest of Russia came to fear and loathe. That shadow was Grigory Rasputin. In the high society salons of Petrograd, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the poison of conspiracy. The ruling class was divided, but they shared a common dread. They watched as the Tsar, once the symbol of national unity, retreated into the isolation of the Alexandra Palace. There, away from the front lines and the shouting of the Duma, a different kind of war was being fought, a war for the Tsar's soul. At the center of this domestic drama was Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. To the Russian people, she was the German woman, a cold and distant figure whose foreign roots made her an easy target for rumors of treason during a war against Germany. But Alexandra's true tragedy was her desperation. Driven by a fanatical desire to save her hemophiliac son Alexei, she turned to the only person who seemed to offer hope, the Siberian holy man, Rasputin. To the Empress, Rasputin was a saint sent by God. To the Russian elite, he was a dark force, a peasant with a reputation for debauchery, who had managed to crawl into the heart of the imperial family. The fact that Rasputin could influence the appointments of ministers and the movements of armies was a lethal insult to the dignity of the nobility. They felt the monarchy was being dragged into the mud. Rumors of secret letters, of sexual scandals, and of Rasputin effectively ruling Russia through the Empress began to circulate not just in the back alleys, but in the highest offices of the land. In a time of national crisis, the Tsar's greatest weakness was his inability to silence these shadows. But the real threat to the throne was more than just a mystic. It was a new, organized political force that had lost all faith in the autocracy. Inside the State Duma, the parliament that Nicholas had always treated with contempt, the opposition was hardening into a weapon. Alexander Guchkov, a wealthy industrialist and leader of the Octoberist Party, were no longer interested in reforms. They were interested in survival. Guchkov and his fellow businessmen realized that the Tsar's incompetence was leading Russia to a military catastrophe. They formed the Provisional Committee and the Military-Industrial Committees to take over the work the government couldn't handle, supplying the troops, organizing hospitals, and keeping the factories running. These men were patriots, but they were also pragmatists. They knew that if the Tsar didn't change, the Tsar had to go. Guchkov would later admit that by the autumn of 1916, serious plans for a palace coup were already being discussed among the generals and the politicians. The tension reached its absolute breaking point on November 1st, 1916. Pavel Milyukov, the leader of the Liberal Cadet Party, stood before the Duma and delivered a speech that would ring through history like a thunderclap. With cold, surgical precision, Milyukov listed the failures of the government, the shell famine, the chaotic supply lines, the influence of Rasputin. After each devastating point, he asked the same question: is this stupidity or is it treason? Milyukov knew exactly what he was doing. He was accusing the prime minister, and by extension the empress herself, of working for the enemy. In any other era, Milyukov would have been arrested for sedition. In 1916, his speech was printed in millions of copies and read by soldiers in the trenches and workers in the factories. It was the psychological end of the monarchy. If the Tsar's own ministers were traitors, why should anyone die for the Tsar? Even more shocking was the Grand Ducal Fronde, the Tsar's own family. The powerful Grand Dukes who carried the Romanov name began to turn against him. These were the men who should have been his ultimate shield. Instead, they were writing letters to Nicholas, begging him to grant a responsible ministry, a government that answered to the Duma, not to him. They warned him that the family was being destroyed by the dark forces around the Empress. Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich, a respected historian and the Tsar's uncle, warned him that he was losing the love of the army. His mother, the Dowager Empress Maria Fyodorovna, pleaded with him to send Rasputin away and listen to the voice of the people. Nicholas, encouraged by Alexandra, saw these warnings as a betrayal. He believed that to give in was to show weakness. He retreated further into his shell, convinced that God would guide him. The elite decided that if the Tsar would not act, they would. In the early hours of December 17, 1916, a group of high-ranking conspirators, including Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, lured Rasputin to the Yusupov Palace. Their goal was simple: kill the monk and save the monarchy. The murder of Rasputin was a scene out of a Gothic nightmare: poison, bullets, and finally drowning in the frozen Moika River. The conspirators thought that by removing the cancer, the body of the empire would heal. They were tragically wrong. The death of Rasputin didn't save the Tsar. It only proved to the world that the imperial family was so paralyzed that only murder could change the course of the nation. By the dawn of 1917, the consensus was total. The aristocrats were conspiring, the politicians were shouting treason, and the generals were quietly discussing which of them would be the first to demand the Tsar's abdication. Nicholas II was a man standing alone on a crumbling cliff. He still believed in the mystical bond with his peasants, but he didn't realize that the peasants were hungry, the soldiers were tired, and the people who were supposed to protect him were already looking for his successor. The shadow of Rasputin had passed, but it left behind a vacuum that only a revolution could fill. History is rarely made by grand orchestrated plans. More often, it is the result of small, uncontrollable sparks that land in a forest that has been drying for decades. On the morning of February 23, 1917, Petrograd was a city of ice and iron. It was International Women's Day, a date that usually passed with minor speeches. But this year, the air felt different. Thousands of women, exhausted factory workers who had spent half their lives in breadlines, poured onto the Viborg side of the city. They didn't start with political slogans. They started with a simple primal cry: bread. The sound of their voices carried across the frozen Naver River. By the afternoon, the crowd had swelled. They were joined by hundreds of thousands of workers from the massive Putilov steel plants. The protest was no longer just about food. It was a release of years of suppressed rage. Trams were derailed, their metal frames screeching against the cobblestones as they were overturned to form crude barricades. From the windows of the British and French embassies, diplomats watched in disbelief. They saw a superpower dissolving before their eyes. Where was the autocrat of all the Russias during this explosion? Nicholas II was hundreds of miles away in Mogilev at the Stavka, the military headquarters of the front. Locked in his quiet, orderly world of maps and military reports, he was profoundly detached from the reality of the streets. His ministers in Petrograd, terrified of his reaction, sent him reports that downplayed the violence, calling it a movement of hooligans. Nicholas believed them. On the evening of February 25th, he sent a short, sharp telegram to General Habalov, the military governor of the capital. It contained an order that would seal the fate of the Romanovs. I command you to suppress the disorders in the capital tomorrow, without fail. It was a command born of total ignorance. Habalov knew that to suppress a crowd of 300,000 meant a massacre. On Sunday, February 26th, the tragedy began. The military opened fire. On Znamienskaya Square, the rhythmic thud of Maxim machine guns tore through the silence of the winter morning. Blood stained the white snow of Petrograd, and hundreds lay dead or wounded. For a moment, it seemed the Tsar had won. The crowds dispersed, hiding in the dark alleyways. But the massacre didn't break the revolution. It broke the soul of the Russian army. The soldiers of the Petrograd garrison were not elite guards. They were young peasants and older reservists who had seen the horrors of the trenches. They looked at the people they were being told to kill and saw their own mothers, their own wives. That night, inside the barracks of the Volinsky regiment, a secret, desperate decision was made. On the morning of February 27th, the world changed. The Volinsky soldiers mutinied. They refused to fire on the people and instead turned their bayonets on their own officers. Within hours, the mutiny spread like a fever. The Preobrazhensky and Litovsky regiments joined them. Tens of thousands of armed soldiers poured into the streets, handing their rifles to the workers. The city descended into total, terrifying chaos. The crowds stormed the main arsenal, seizing 40,000 rifles and even more pistols. They marched on the district courts, burning the symbols of imperial law, the smoke rising in thick black pillars over the city. The most symbolic moment was the storming of the Kresty prison. The massive iron gates were smashed, and thousands of prisoners, both political radicals and common criminals, were set free into a world that no longer had any rules. The police, the pharaohs of the regime, vanished. They stripped off their uniforms and hid in cellars, knowing to be seen in a police coat meant instant death. While the streets burned, two centers of power emerged inside the halls of the Tauride Palace. In one wing, the members of the State Duma formed the Provisional Committee. They were aristocrats and liberals, terrified of the mob, but desperate to save the country. In the other wing,
a more radical shadow was forming: the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. These were the men with the guns. This dual power would become the curse of the revolution. And in the middle of it all was Alexander Kerensky, a man of incredible energy, running from one wing to the other, trying to hold the fragments of a dying world together. Nicholas II finally realized his empire was slipping away. He boarded his imperial train, a palace on wheels filled with luxury and telegraph machines, and headed for Petrograd. But he was a king who no longer controlled his own roads. Striking railway workers diverted his train, blocking the tracks with freight cars. The autocrat of all the Russias was forced to detour to the city of Pskov, arriving late in the evening on March 1st. The station at Pskov became the final stage of the Romanov drama. The imperial train stood on a lonely side track, hissed by steam and surrounded by shadows. Inside the dimly lit carriage, Nicholas was met by General Nikolai Ruzsky. Ruzsky was no longer the subservient general. He was the bearer of a brutal reality. For hours he sat with the Tsar, showing him the telegrams from the capital. Nicholas still hoped to send a punitive expedition to crush the city, but Ruzsky told him the truth. There were no loyal troops left.
The final blow came on the morning of March 2nd. Nicholas received a series of telegrams from the commanders of all the Russian fronts, the very men he had led as commander-in-chief. Alexeyev, Brusilov, Evert. One by one, the generals urged the Tsar to abdicate. The most painful telegram came from his own cousin, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who begged him on his knees to step down for the sake of the army and the war against Germany. Nicholas was shattered. He realized that the mystical bond he believed he had with the people and the army was a lie. He wrote in his diary that night, "All around is treason, cowardice, and deceit." Late that evening, two representatives from the Duma, Alexander Guchkov and Vasily Shulgin, arrived at Pskov. They were exhausted, covered in the dust of the revolution. They found the Tsar in a simple blue railway carriage. He looked calm, almost relieved. He had spent the day in deep thought, and as a devoted father, he had reached a final heartbreaking conclusion. He knew his son, Alexei, was too ill with hemophilia to rule alone. He could not bear to see the boy torn from the family and used as a puppet by the revolutionaries. With a steady hand and a pencil, Nicholas II signed the act of abdication. He passed the throne not to his son, but to his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. In that small, quiet railway car, while the steam hissed outside and the world he knew was being torn to pieces, Nicholas believed he was performing a final act of sacrifice to save Russia from a civil war. He didn't realize that by signing that paper, he was removing the only pillar that had held the vast, diverse, and violent Russian Empire for 300 years. As the train pulled away from the Pskov station into the dark Russian night, the monarchy was over. Nicholas II was no longer a god on earth. He was a man without a country.
On the cold, gray morning of March 3rd, 1917, the people of Russia woke up to a world that felt fundamentally different. The double-headed eagle of the Romanovs, which had looked down from every government building for 3 centuries, suddenly looked like a relic of a dead age. But while the streets were celebrating, the final act of the dynastic drama was playing out in a private apartment on Milyanaya Street in Petrograd. Nicholas II had abdicated in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. For a few brief, tense hours, the fate of 1/6 of the earth rested on this one man's shoulders. Mikhail was not a revolutionary.
But he was a man of his time, uncertain, hesitant, and acutely aware of the blood that had already been spilled. He was surrounded by the leaders of the Duma, men like Rodzianko and Milyukov, who argued late into the night. Some begged him to take the crown to prevent total anarchy. Others, like Alexander Kerensky, warned him that the streets would not tolerate another czar. Kerensky's voice was the loudest. He told Mikhail that if he accepted the throne, the revolutionary mob would storm the house and kill everyone inside. Mikhail chose peace over power. He issued a manifesto declaring that he would only accept the supreme authority if it were granted to him by the will of the people through a future constituent assembly. In that moment, the Romanov dynasty didn't just fall, it vanished into thin air. The transition was so quiet, so anticlimactic, that many struggled to believe it was real. What followed was one of the most remarkable and bizarre institutional collapses in human history. The very pillars that had supported the autocracy for generations, the church, the military elite, and the bureaucracy, didn't fight for the Tsar. They abandoned him in a heartbeat. The Orthodox Church, which had for centuries preached that the Tsar was the anointed of God, moved with staggering speed to recognize the new reality. Within days of the abdication, the Holy Synod, the governing body of the Church, ordered the removal of the Tsar's throne from its meeting hall. They replaced the prayers for the imperial family with prayers for the grateful provisional government. To the common peasant, who had been told for centuries that to disobey the Tsar was a mortal sin, this betrayal by the clergy was a profound psychological shock. It signaled that the old spiritual world was dead. The aristocracy and the wealthy industrial elite followed suit. These were men and women who owed their titles, their lands, and their fortunes to the Romanovs. Yet they suddenly appeared on the streets wearing red ribbons, the symbol of the revolution. They believed that by sacrificing the Tsar, they could save their own positions. They convinced themselves that without the clumsy anchor of Nicholas II, Russia would finally become a modern, Western-style democracy. They were the architects of a bourgeois revolution, but they didn't realize they were building their house on top of a volcano.
A new government was formed, the Provisional Government. It was a collection of the most brilliant minds in the Russian Empire. Prince Lvov, a noble idealist. Pavel Milyukov, a world-class historian. Alexander Guchkov, the titan of industry. They declared Russia to be the freest country in the world. They abolished the death penalty, granted total freedom of speech and religion, and promised an immediate amnesty for all political prisoners. To the observers in Washington and London, it looked like a miracle, the birth of a new democratic ally. But this February dream was hollow from the start. The provisional government suffered from a fatal structural defect that historians call dual power. While the government held the grand titles and the official offices, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies held the actual power of the street and the gun. The Soviet controlled the railways, the post offices, and the hearts of the armed soldiers. In the middle of a world war, the army, the only thing standing between Russia and the German Kaiser, began to dissolve into a debating club. Amidst this rising chaos, Alexander Kerensky became the face of the new era. He was a man of theatrical energy, a lawyer who believed that his speeches could hold the nation together. He would later become the head of the government, hailed as the first love of the revolution. Kerensky was a tragic figure. In interviews decades later, from his exile in the United States and Britain, he would reflect on these days with a deep sense of loss. He believed that February was Russia's great chance, a moment of national rebirth that was ruined not by the Tsar, but by the radicalism that followed. The tragedy of the February Revolution is that it was a revolution of good intentions,
led by men who didn't understand the violent nature of power. The liberals and moderates who took the stage in February 1917 believed that the Russian people wanted democracy. They didn't realize that a hungry, exhausted, and illiterate population wanted something much simpler: bread, land, and an end to the war at any cost.
By removing the Tsar, the leaders of February removed the only symbol of authority that the vast majority of Russians understood. They created a vacuum of power that they were too weak to fill. The very freedoms they granted, the freedom to speak, to organize, and to strike, were the tools that a much more radical and disciplined force would use to destroy them. Just a few months after the abdication of Nicholas II, a man named Vladimir Lenin would arrive at the Finland station in Petrograd. He saw what the men of February could not: that the Russian Empire was an abandoned house, and all he had to do was kick in the door. The fall of the Romanovs was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the collapse of a civilization. Nicholas II had spent his life trying to stop time, only to be crushed by it. He believed his bond with the simple people was eternal, but he found in his final hours that he was alone in a silent railway car. The too little, too late reforms of the past century had finally caught up with the present. The bells of old Russia had stopped ringing, and in their place, a new and much darker music was beginning to play, the music of a century of fire and iron. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth exploration of the February Revolution. It is a story of how a superpower can vanish in a heartbeat when its leaders lose touch with reality. If you want to see more documentaries exploring the hidden turning points of history, please like this video and share it. What do you think? Could the Romanovs have survived if they had acted sooner? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for our next chapter, The Rise of the Bolsheviks. This was the story of the end of an empire. We will see you next time.
The Tsar was gone, but the revolution that removed him was only getting started. Russia now had 8 months to decide what it would become, and 2 men, Kerensky and Lenin, racing to decide it first. October 25, 1917, 9:40 p.m. A deafening boom shatters the frosted windows of the Winter Palace in Petrograd. It is the blast from the cruiser Aurora, signaling the end of an era. Inside the palace, the ministers of the Russian government are trembling in the dark. The phone lines are dead. The electricity has been cut. Their prime minister has fled the city in a foreign car. The only people left defending the government of the largest empire on earth are a battalion of teenage cadets and a unit of women volunteers, the Women's Battalion of Death. They are clutching rifles they barely know how to use. Outside, they are surrounded by thousands of angry sailors and Red Guards, waiting for the final order to storm the gates. But the most terrifying part isn't the siege itself. It is what is happening just a few blocks away. While the government is being held at gunpoint, the restaurants on the main avenue are packed. The opera is performing. The trams are running on schedule. The wealthy elite are drinking champagne, completely ignoring the fact that their world is ending right next door. This was not a heroic battle. This was a surgical operation performed while the patient was asleep. In just 24 hours, a small group of radicals stole Russia. But the shockwave of this night went far beyond the Russian borders. It was the most significant political event of the 20th century. It changed the course of human history, divided the globe in two, and defined the fate of the entire world for decades to come. How did it happen? Who let the chaos in? This is the anatomy of the Red October. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the truth about history. Let's begin. To understand how the country reached the edge of the abyss by October, we must rewind the clock 7 months, back to the spring, back to the moment when the hope was still alive. In our previous episode, which you can watch by clicking the link in the description, we detailed the fatal mistake of Tsar Nicholas II and his abdication. When the Romanov dynasty fell in February 1917, Russia experienced a collective euphoria. It was like a nationwide honeymoon. Overnight, Russia transformed from an absolute autocracy into the freest country on earth. The secret police were disbanded. Censorship was abolished. You could stand on a street corner and scream anything you wanted against the government, and no one would arrest you. The prisons were opened. Political exiles were invited home. The world looked at Russia with admiration. The United States was the first country to officially recognize the new government. It seemed that Russia was destined to become a great modern democracy. But there is a dangerous side to absolute freedom. If you take the lid off a boiling pot too quickly, you don't get soup, you get an explosion. The new reality was not paradise. It was chaos. The police had been dissolved, but no one had created a new force to replace them. The streets of Petrograd were flooded with criminals released from prisons along with the political prisoners. Crime skyrocketed. Mob justice became the new law. If a crowd caught a thief in the market, they didn't call the police because there were no police. Suspected thieves were often killed by angry crowds on the spot. But the biggest problem wasn't crime. It was power, or rather, the lack of it. Russia fell into a strange political paralysis known as the dual power. Imagine a ship in the middle of a storm with 2 captains on the bridge fighting for the steering wheel. On one side, sitting in the ornate halls of the Mariinsky Palace, was the provisional government. These were the men in suits, lawyers, professors, princes, and industrialists. They were the legal authority. They wanted Russia to be a civilized European state. They believed in law, order, and obligations. On the other side, sitting in the Tauride Palace, was the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. These were the men in gray greatcoats. They were not elected by the general population. They were elected by the factories and the army barracks. They controlled the telegraphs, the railroads, and most importantly, they controlled the soldiers. The provisional government had the responsibility, but no power. The Soviet had the power, but took no responsibility. The provisional government made its first fatal error almost immediately. They wanted to be the good guys. They wanted to be honorable allies. Russia owed billions of francs and pounds to France and Britain. So the government announced, "We will honor our commitments. We will fight the war to a victorious end." This was exactly what the Russian people did not want to hear. The soldiers in the trenches were rotting. They didn't care about honor or Constantinople or treaties with London. They were cold, hungry, and terrified of German gas attacks. When the new government said the war continues, the soldiers felt betrayed. They had overthrown the Tsar to end the war, not to die for a new set of masters. And then, the Petrograd Soviet struck a blow that broke the backbone of the Russian army. They issued Order Number 1. This document is crucial to understanding the collapse. It sounds democratic. It gave soldiers civil rights. But in practice, it destroyed discipline. It told soldiers they no longer had to salute their officers. It allowed soldiers to elect committees that could vote on whether to attack or retreat. Can you imagine an army where the soldiers vote on orders? It was madness. Officers who tried to enforce discipline were ignored, beaten, or even killed by their own men. The Russian front began to crumble. Inside the country, the situation was no better. The peasants, who made up 80% of the population, were waiting for one thing: land. They wanted the estates of the aristocrats broken up and given to them. The provisional government said, "Wait, we must do this legally. We must wait for the Constituent Assembly to pass a law." Wait, that was the word that killed the provisional government. They asked starving people to wait for legal procedures.
By April 1917, the honeymoon was over. The euphoria had turned into irritation. The economy was spiraling into hyperinflation. Bread lines were getting longer. The people felt cheated. They had freedom, but you cannot eat freedom. They wanted concrete solutions. The country was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The government was weak, the army was mutinous, and the people were angry. The stage was perfectly set for a radical force to enter the scene. Someone who wouldn't ask the people to wait. Someone who would offer them everything they wanted immediately. And that someone was already on a train crossing the German border.
April 16, 1917. Late at night, the Finland station in Petrograd is engulfed in steam and nervous energy. A train pulls in. It has traveled thousands of miles across war-torn Europe. On board is Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks. Now, you might be asking, how did a Russian radical cross through Germany, Russia's enemy in World War I, without being arrested? Who paid for his ticket? Was he working for foreign intelligence? This is one of the greatest detective stories of the 20th century. I have a separate full-length documentary on this channel called Lenin and the German Gold, where we uncover the secret financial trails, the sealed train, and the spy network that brought him here. If you haven't seen it, pause this video, click the link in the corner, and watch it. It is essential to understanding the financial engine behind this revolution. But today, we are focusing on what happened the moment he stepped onto the platform, because that is when the real weapon was deployed. Lenin didn't come back to make friends. He came back to break the system. When he stepped off the train, the moderate socialists, the Mensheviks, were waiting for him with bouquets of flowers. They gave polite speeches about unity and defending the revolution together. They thought Lenin was just another politician who would join the debate club. They were wrong. Lenin ignored the flowers. He turned his back on the welcoming committee. He walked out of the station, climbed onto the hood of an armored car, and shouted into the night, "The piratical imperialist war is the beginning of civil war throughout Europe. Long live the worldwide socialist revolution." The crowd roared. The politicians were horrified. In just 2 minutes, Lenin had declared war on everyone, on the provisional government, on the moderate socialists, and on the war itself. The next day, he published his manifesto, the April Theses. To the political elite of Petrograd, this document looked like the ravings of a madman. Even his own party members thought he had lost his mind in isolation. Lenin demanded the impossible. 1. No support for the provisional government. 2. Immediate end to the war. 3. Abolition of the police, army, and bureaucracy. 4. All power to the Soviets. 5. Confiscation of all landlord estates. It was radical, it was illegal, and it was exactly what the people wanted to hear.
This is the secret to Lenin's success. While Prime Minister Kerensky and the provisional government were talking like lawyers, using complex words about international obligations, strategic patience, and electoral procedures, Lenin talked like a marketing genius. He distilled his entire program into 3 words. 3 words that every illiterate peasant and exhausted soldier could understand. Peace, land, bread. Think about the psychology of a Russian soldier in 1917. He is sitting in a muddy trench. He hasn't eaten meat in weeks. He receives a letter from his wife saying the children are starving in the village. Then the provisional government tells him, "Fight for the honor of Russia. Die for the Straits of the Dardanelles." It meant nothing to him. Then a Bolshevik agitator arrives and says, "Lenin says, go home, take your rifle, kill the landlord, take his land, eat his bread, and stop fighting the Germans." Who would you support?
The man offering you honor or the man offering you survival? It wasn't a political choice. It was a transaction. Lenin didn't win the hearts of the people with Marxist theory. He bought their loyalty by legalizing their darkest desires, to stop fighting and take property that wasn't theirs. By the summer of 1917, the Bolshevik slogans were spreading like a virus through the army barracks and factories. The provisional government tried to fight them with logic, but you cannot fight hunger with logic. However, Lenin's path to power was not a straight line. In fact, just 3 months after his arrival, he faced a catastrophe that almost destroyed him. The marketing genius pushed too fast, too hard, and the system fought back. The summer of 1917 would bring blood to the streets of Petrograd, and for a brief moment, it looked like the Bolshevik story was over before it began.
Summer 1917. Petrograd is sweltering in the heat. The air is thick with dust, sweat, and revolution. Alexander Kerensky, the Minister of War and the rising star of the provisional government, decides to make a gamble. He believes that the only way to unite the crumbling country is through a glorious military victory. He wants to prove to Britain and France that Russia is still a superpower. He orders a massive offensive on the Eastern Front. It becomes known as the Kerensky Offensive. He tours the front lines, giving passionate speeches, kissing soldiers and handing out medals. He thinks he's Napoleon. But speeches cannot stop bullets. The offensive is a catastrophe. The German army, disciplined and well-equipped, crushes the disorganized Russian troops. Instead of glory, Kerensky gets a slaughter. Tens of thousands are killed. The Russian army doesn't just retreat, it runs. Soldiers shoot their own officers in the back and desert in mass waves, looting their own villages on the way home. When the news of this disaster reaches Petrograd, the city explodes. On July 3rd, the July Days begin. This is the first attempt by the Bolsheviks to seize power by force. It is messy, chaotic, and bloody. Armed trucks race down the Nevsky Prospect. Machine guns are set up on rooftops, firing into the crowds. The Bolsheviks, pushed by the radical sailors of Kronstadt, demand the immediate overthrow of the government. For a moment, it looks like the government will fall. They are besieged in the Taurid Palace. But then, the provisional government plays its ace card, the weapon we discussed earlier. The Minister of Justice releases a bombshell dossier to the press. The headline screams, "Lenin is a German spy." They publish the details of the financial network, the money from Berlin, the connections with Parvis. The impact is nuclear. The mood in the streets flips instantly. The soldiers of the Petrograd garrison who were wavering are furious. They are dying at the front fighting Germans, while this man Lenin is taking German money in the rear. Traitor! The word echoes through the city. Loyal troops storm the Bolshevik headquarters. They smash the printing presses of Pravda. They hunt down Bolshevik leaders. Leon Trotsky is thrown into prison. And Lenin, the man who promised to lead the revolution, he vanishes. Realizing that he will be executed for treason if caught, Lenin shaves off his iconic beard and mustache. He puts on a wig and disguises himself as a Finnish worker. He flees the city in the middle of the night. He ends up hiding in a literal swamp near the border of Finland at a place called Rosliv. He lives in a hut made of hay and branches, fighting off mosquitoes, writing his manifesto on a tree stump. It is a humiliating fall from grace. The great leader is now a fugitive living in a haystack. The Bolshevik party is banned. Their press is destroyed. Their leaders are in jail or in hiding. By August 1917, it seems that the Bolshevik threat is dead and buried. Alexander Kerensky becomes the prime minister. He moves into the Winter Palace.
He sleeps in the Tsar's bed. He is now the undisputed ruler of Russia. He believes he has saved democracy. But Kerensky is drunk on his own power. He thinks his enemy is the left, the Bolsheviks. He doesn't realize that by destroying the left, he has left himself completely exposed to the right. The conservative elites, the industrialists, and the military officers are tired of chaos. They're tired of committees and voting soldiers. They don't want a socialist lawyer like Kerensky. They want a strong man, a dictator who will hang the radicals and restore order with an iron fist. And they have found their candidate. Enter General Lov Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the army, a war hero with a face carved from granite. He despises the Bolsheviks, he despises the Soviets, and secretly, he despises Kerensky too. The stage is set for the final duel, a battle between two egos, the prime minister and the general, that will tear the country apart and open the door for the monster to return from the swamp.
August 1917. The fate of Russia is now balanced on a razor's edge. On one side, we have Alexander Kerensky, the prime minister. He represents the center. He wants to maintain the revolution, keep the republic, and somehow please everyone. But in trying to please everyone, he has pleased no one. The economy is dead, the army is collapsing, the streets are dangerous. On the other side, we have General Lov Kornilov. He represents the right. He is a man of action. He doesn't care about committees or speeches. He wants to hang the German spies, disperse the Soviet, and force the soldiers back into the trenches at gunpoint. For the conservative half of Russia, the businessmen, the landowners, the officers, and the church, Kornilov is a savior. They call him the Russian George Washington. They are waiting for him to march on Petrograd and clean up the mess. And Kornilov decides to do exactly that. In late August, he orders his troops to move toward the capital. His spearhead is the terrifying Savage Division, a cavalry unit made up of fierce warriors from the Caucasus Mountains who do not speak Russian and are loyal only to their commanders. Kornilov's goal, according to him, is to save the government from the Bolsheviks, to crush the radical Soviets and give Kerensky the military power he needs to rule. But Kerensky panics. This is the moment where the psychological profile of the leader changes history. Kerensky is vain, he is jealous, and he is paranoid. He sits in the Winter Palace and convinces himself that Kornilov isn't coming to save him, he's coming to replace him. He fears that he will become the first victim of a military dictatorship. Kerensky faces a choice that will determine the fate of the 20th century. Option A, trust the general, crush the radicals, and risk losing his own power to a military junta. Option B, ally with the radicals to stop the general and risk being eaten by the revolution later.
Kerensky chooses option B, and it is the most fatal error in Russian history. On August 27th, Kerensky does the unthinkable. He sends a telegram to the Petrograd Soviet, the very people who hate him. He asks for their help. Defend the revolution, he begs. But the Bolsheviks are in prison. Their leaders are hunted men. They have no weapons because the government took them away in July. So Kerensky commits self-destruction, not physically, but politically. He orders the prisons opened. Bolshevik leaders, including Leon Trotsky, are released, and then he orders the government armories to be unlocked. Over 40,000 military rifles are handed out to the Red Guards, the Bolshevik workers' militias. Pause and think about the insanity of this moment. The prime minister of a democratic government is handing out machine guns and rifles to a radical armed faction that has openly promised to overthrow him. He is arming his own executioners to save himself from a general who wanted to restore order. The result is immediate. Kornilov's coup fails before it even begins. But it fails not because of a battle. It fails because of propaganda. The newly released Bolshevik agitators rush to the railroad tracks. They stop Kornilov's trains. They talk to the Savage Division. They tell the soldiers, "Your general is lying to you. He is betraying the revolution." The soldiers, tired and confused, refuse to fight. They arrest their own officers. General Kornilov is arrested. The right is decapitated. The army loses its last shred of discipline. Kerensky celebrates. He thinks he has won. He has eliminated his rival, the scary general. He is still the prime minister. But when the dust settles, Kerensky looks around and realizes the terrible reality of what he has done. The Bolsheviks are now free. Their leaders are heroes who saved the city. Their popularity is skyrocketing. And most importantly, they have 40,000 rifles. And when Kerensky politely asks them to return the weapons, they just laugh at him. "Return them? No, comrade. We might need them for later." The balance of power has shifted permanently. The government is defenseless. The army is broken. The only armed force left in the capital is the Red Guard. Lenin, watching from his hiding place in Finland, sees this. He realizes that Kerensky has just dug his own grave. The German spy label is forgotten. The Bolsheviks are now the defenders of Petrograd. Lenin picks up his pen and writes a frantic letter to the Central Committee in Petrograd. The message is simple and terrifying. History will not forgive us if we do not take power now. The dress rehearsal is over. The stage is cleared. The actors are armed. It is time for the final act.
October 1917, the Smolny Institute. Before the revolution, this building was a finishing school for noble maidens. Daughters of aristocrats learned French, dancing, and good manners here. Now, the smell of perfume has been replaced by the stench of cheap tobacco, wet wool, and gun oil. This is the headquarters of the Bolsheviks. It is a fortress. Machine guns are set up in the corridors. Armored cars are parked in the garden. And in room 10, a man with wild hair and wire-rimmed glasses is planning the end of the world. Leon Trotsky. While Lenin is the brain of the revolution hiding in Finland, Trotsky is the sword. He is right there in the center of the action, and he comes up with a plan that is pure genius in its deception. Trotsky knows that if the Bolsheviks simply announce, "We are taking power," the other socialist parties might unite against them. So he decides to lie. He creates an organization with a boring bureaucratic name, the Military Revolutionary Committee, or MRC. He tells the public, this committee is to defend Petrograd from the Germans and from counter-revolutionaries like Kornilov. It is a Trojan horse. On paper, it is a defense committee. In reality, it is a headquarters for an armed uprising. Under the guise of defending the city, Trotsky sends his commissars to every armory and garrison. They take control of the rifles, the ammunition, and the loyalty of the troops, and they do it legally, using Kerensky's own fear of a right-wing coup as cover. Kerensky watches this happen. He suspects something is wrong, but he is paralyzed. He is like a rabbit caught in headlights. On October 10th, the final decision is made. Lenin decides he can no longer wait in Finland. He risks everything. He shaves his beard again, puts on a wig, bandages his cheek as if he has a toothache, and takes a train to Petrograd. He arrives at a secret apartment for a meeting of the Central Committee. It's a tense, smoke-filled room. Lenin is furious. He screams at his comrades. He tells them that the country is falling apart, the peasants are revolting, and the moment is now. History will not forgive us if we do not take power now, he pounds on the table. But the party is split. Two of Lenin's closest allies, Zinoviev and Kamyev, vote against the uprising. They think it is suicide.
They think they will be crushed just like in July. And then they commit the ultimate betrayal. Zinoviev and Kamyev write an article in a non-Bolshevik newspaper, essentially leaking the secret plan. They warn the public, the Bolsheviks are planning a disaster. Imagine this. The date of the top-secret coup is published in the morning newspapers.
Kerensky reads the paper. He knows the coup is coming. He knows the date. He knows the enemy. He has the perfect excuse to arrest them all. But he does nothing. Why? Because he has no one left to give orders to. The army officers hate him for betraying Kornilov. The soldiers hate him for the war. The police don't exist. Kerensky sits in the Winter Palace surrounded by phones that don't ring, issuing orders that no one obeys. On the morning of October 24th, the coup begins. But if you were expecting scenes from a Hollywood movie, explosions, screaming mobs, barricades of burning tires, you would be disappointed. This was a phantom coup. Trotsky's plan was surgical. He didn't send angry mobs into the streets. He sent small, disciplined squads of professional revolutionaries and sailors. They moved through the fog like ghosts. A squad of sailors walked into the Central Telegraph office. They didn't shoot. They just told the guards, "Go home. We are in charge now." And the guards went home. Another squad walked into the state bank. Another took the electric power station. Another took the main post office. They seized the nervous system of the city. They cut off the government's communications, their money, and their light. And the most surreal part? The city didn't notice. On the Nevsky Prospect, the main avenue, life went on as usual. The shops were open, the trams were running, rich ladies were buying furs. Officers were sitting in cafes drinking coffee, debating politics. They looked out the window and saw a few trucks of soldiers driving by. Oh, just another patrol, they thought. They didn't realize that those trucks were carrying the new government. By the evening of October 24th, the Bolsheviks controlled the bridges, the railway stations, and the communications. The provisional government controlled exactly one building, the Winter Palace. Kerensky was trapped. He looked out the window and saw the bridges raising across the Neva, cutting off his escape. He realized, too late, that his game was over. The next morning, October 25th, Kerensky made a desperate move. He didn't rally the troops. He didn't lead a last stand. He borrowed a car from the American embassy, a Renault flying the American flag, and fled the city, promising to bring back loyal troops from the front. He never returned. Inside the Winter Palace, the remaining ministers sat around a table in the Malachite room. They were alone. No prime minister, no army, just a battalion of women and teenage boys in the courtyard, shivering in the cold wind. The trap was shut. The phantom coup was complete. All that was left was to walk into the palace and pick up the power that was lying on the floor. October 25th, 1917, 9:40 p.m. The cruiser Aurora, anchored in the middle of the Neva River, fires a single shot. Boom. For decades, Soviet propaganda films showed this moment as the start of an epic battle. In the movies, thousands of heroic workers stormed the gates, climbing over iron fences, fighting hand-to-hand with the defenders while machine guns blazed from the windows. The reality was much stranger and much more pathetic. The shell fired by the Aurora was a blank. It didn't destroy anything. It was purely psychological warfare. A loud noise to tell the people inside the palace, your time is up. Inside the Winter Palace, the situation was hopeless. The defenders were a tragic mix. First, there were the Junkers, cadets from military schools. Imagine high school students given rifles and told to defend the government. Second, there was the Women's Battalion of Death.
These were female volunteers who had signed up to fight the Germans because the men were deserting. Now, they were the only ones brave enough to stay and defend the prime minister who had already run away. The irony is devastating. The male ministers of the provisional government were cowering in the Malachite room, protected by teenage boys and women. As the night went on, the defense simply evaporated. The Cossacks, who were supposed to guard the back entrance, got bored and left to get dinner. The artillerymen took their cannons and went home because it was getting late. The Bolshevik assault wasn't a charge. It was a slow infiltration. The Winter Palace is huge. It has over 1,000 rooms and hundreds of entrances. The servants had forgotten to lock the back doors. Small groups of Bolshevik sailors and Red Guards just walked in through the unlocked basement doors. They wandered through the dark hallways, getting lost in the labyrinth of imperial luxury. Sometimes they bumped into a group of cadets, disarmed them, and kept walking. There was very little shooting. It was more like a game of hide and seek than a battle. By 2 a.m., the attackers found the Malachite room. Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko, a Bolshevik leader with long hair and a wide-brimmed hat, kicked open the door. He pointed his pistol at the terrified ministers sitting around the table. "In the name of the Military Revolutionary Committee, you are under arrest," he said. The ministers didn't fight. They didn't protest. They just surrendered. They were led out of the palace, past the jeering crowds, and taken to the Peter and Paul fortress. The provisional government was dead. The Soviet era had begun. But immediately after the victory, the Bolsheviks faced their first major crisis, and it wasn't a counterattack, it was alcohol. The Winter Palace held the Tsar's private wine cellar. It was one of the largest collections of vintage wine and spirits in the world. Thousands of bottles of rare cognac, champagne, and vodka. When the Red Guards discovered the cellar, the revolution stopped. The wine pogroms began. For days, the square in front of the palace was filled with drunken soldiers. They drank straight from the bottles. They sold vodka to passers-by. The Bolshevik leaders were terrified. They realized their disciplined revolutionary army was turning into a drunken mob. They tried everything to stop it. They walled up the entrances. The soldiers broke through the walls. They poured the wine into the canals. The soldiers jumped into the freezing water to drink from the canal. Finally, they had to send fire brigades to pump the wine out of the cellars and flush it into the Neva River. It was a perfect metaphor for what was to come. The old regime was gone, but the chaos was just beginning. While the soldiers were drinking the Tsar's wine, Vladimir Lenin walked onto the stage at the Smolny Institute. He took off his wig. He looked out at the sea of tired, dirty faces in the hall, the Congress of Soviets. He didn't smile. He simply said, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." And he immediately laid 2 sheets of paper on the podium, 2 documents that would change the world. The morning after the coup, Russia woke up to a new reality. But most people didn't understand what had just happened. Was this just another change of ministers? Would these Bolsheviks last a week? Lenin knew that his power was incredibly fragile. He sat in the Smolny Institute, looking at a map of Russia. He controlled Petrograd, that's it. The rest of the empire, the millions of peasants, the generals on the front, the Cossacks on the Don, did not recognize him. To survive, Lenin needed to buy loyalty, and he bought it with the most expensive currency in the world, the future of the country. On October 26th, he stood before the Congress of Soviets and read 2 short documents. The first document, the Decree on Peace. Lenin declared an immediate end to the war. No conditions, no negotiations, just stop. To the millions of soldiers freezing in the trenches, this was a miracle. It was permission to drop their rifles and walk away. It was the legalization of desertion. Lenin didn't care that this was a betrayal of Russia's allies, Britain and France. He didn't care that Germany would demand huge territories in exchange. He needed the soldiers to love him, and they did. The second document, the Decree on Land. In one sentence, Lenin abolished private property. He declared that all land owned by the landlords, the church, and the Tsar now belonged to the peasants. Go and take it, he essentially said. It was the greatest wealth transfer in human history. In every village across Russia, peasants grabbed pitchforks and axes. They marched to the manor houses of the aristocracy, the houses where their ancestors had worked as slaves. They burned the libraries, smashed the pianos, and divided the land among themselves. This was the great bribe. Lenin didn't win the Civil War because of ideology. He won because he let the people loot the country. He made every peasant and every soldier an accomplice in the revolution. If the Tsar came back, they would lose the land they had just stolen, so they had to fight for Lenin. But while the masses were celebrating, the intellectual elite of Russia looked on in absolute horror. The writers, the poets, the professors, they realized that the Russia they knew was dead.
Ivan Bunin, the famous writer and future Nobel Prize winner, wrote in his diary, "Cursed Days." Petrograd is unrecognizable. The city is filled with a new kind of face, ugly, cruel, dull faces, the faces of the mob. We are walking on the edge of a volcano. Zinaida Gippius, a poet, wrote, "It feels like we are all buried alive. The air smells of blood and madness." They saw what the peasants didn't see yet. They saw that behind the free land and the peace, a new machine of terror was being built. Because Lenin wasn't just passing laws, he was crushing resistance. And resistance did happen. While Petrograd fell without a fight, Moscow decided to fight back. In Moscow, the local Bolsheviks tried to seize the Kremlin, but the commander of the Moscow military district, Colonel Ryabtsev, was not like Kerensky. He didn't run away. He organized the Junkers and the officers. For 7 days, Moscow turned into a war zone. Artillery shells smashed into the holy walls of the Kremlin. The golden domes of the cathedrals were shattered by machine gun fire. There was vicious street fighting. Students from the universities grabbed rifles to fight against the Red Guards. It was a bloodbath. Thousands died in the streets of Moscow. Trenches were dug on Tverskaya Street. In the end, the Bolsheviks brought in heavy artillery and bombarded the city into submission. The defenders of Moscow surrendered. The Red Guards massacred many of them after they had laid down their weapons. The smoking ruins of Moscow sent a message to the rest of the country. The Bolsheviks are not playing games. They will destroy the holiest shrines of Russia to keep power. But there was one last hope for democracy, one final illusion that everyone was clinging to: the Constituent Assembly. Remember? For 8 months, everyone had been waiting for the elections. The Bolsheviks had promised to hold them. Even after seizing power, Lenin didn't dare cancel the vote. He was too afraid of the public reaction. So, in November 1917, the election happened. It was the first and last free election in Russian history until the fall of the Soviet Union. The results were a shock for Lenin. The Bolsheviks lost. They got only 24% of the vote. The winners were the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Peasant Party, who got over 40%.
The people had spoken. They wanted socialism, but they didn't want Lenin. They wanted democracy. Lenin looked at the results. He had a choice: respect the will of the people and step down, or destroy the parliament. For Vladimir Lenin, it wasn't even a choice. The people, he said, have voted for the past. We are the future. On January 5th, 1918, the Constituent Assembly gathered for its first session. The delegates made speeches about freedom and law. They felt important. They thought they were the government. Lenin sat in a private box watching them like a predator watching sheep. He laughed. He signaled to his guards. A sailor named Zhelezniak walked up to the Speaker of the Parliament, put a heavy hand on the Speaker's shoulder, and said the famous phrase, "The guard is tired. Close the meeting." The lights were turned off. The deputies were pushed out into the snow. The doors were locked. And just like that, Russian democracy was over. It lasted for exactly 13 hours. The next day, people tried to demonstrate in support of the assembly. The Bolsheviks set up machine guns on the rooftops and fired into the unarmed crowd. The message was clear. The ballot box was dead. The only vote that counted now was the bullet. To ensure that no one else would dare to resist, Lenin created a new organization. On December 20th, he signed a decree creating the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission. He appointed a Polish fanatic, Felix Dzerzhinsky, to run it. Dzerzhinsky was a man with cold eyes who said, "We don't need justice, we need to settle accounts." The machine of the Red Terror was turned on. By early 1918, the Bolsheviks had seized the capitals. They had dispersed the parliament. They had established the secret police. But there was one final bill left to pay: the German bill. Remember, the Germans had helped Lenin for a reason. They wanted Russia out of the war, and now they demanded their prize. In March 1918, at the city of Brest-Litovsk, the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty with Germany. It wasn't a treaty, it was a humiliation. To buy peace and stay in power, Lenin gave away Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, and Finland. Russia lost 34% of its population, 54% of its industrial land, and 89% of its coal fields. It was an amputation. Lenin cut off a third of the Russian body to save his own political head. For the patriots of Russia, the officers, the Cossacks, the students, this was the final straw. They realized that their country hadn't just been stolen, it had been sold to the enemy. In the south, in the frozen steppes of the Don, the former generals of the Tsar began to gather an army, a white army. They swore to march on Moscow, hang the Bolsheviks, and restore Russia's honor. Lenin knew they were coming, and he was ready. He had turned the country into a fortress. He had promised his followers a paradise, but he prepared them for hell. The October Revolution was technically over. The Bolsheviks had won the coup, but the victory was an illusion. The easy part was taking the Winter Palace. The hard part was surviving the consequences. The bloodless revolution of 1917 was about to turn into the bloodiest civil war in human history. A war where brother would kill brother, where fathers would execute their sons, where famine would force and famine so extreme it shattered families and morality. The empire is dead. The Soviet Union is born in blood. But that story is for the next episode. If you want to understand the man who engineered this entire catastrophe, you must watch my deep dive documentary, Lenin, the German Spy. It explains the money trail that made October possible. And if you want to see how the Romanov dynasty fell in the first place, watch the episode about Nicholas II and his fatal error. History is a chain of events. Do not break the chain. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and I will see you in the trenches of the Civil War. Lenin had taken Petrograd, and in a requisitioned house in the Urals, the former ruler of 1/6 of the earth was now prisoner number 1, running out of time. This is the last night of the Romanovs, minute by minute. May 30th, 1979. A desolate, swampy forest on the outskirts of Sverdlovsk, deep inside the Soviet Union. Two men are digging in the mud, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. They are risking everything. One is Alexander Abdication, a local geologist who knows this land. The other is Gely Ryabov, a filmmaker from Moscow with connections to the party elite. They are not looking for gold. They are hunting for ghosts. They are guided by a single 60-year-old document, a secret note written by a killer that boasts of a perfect crime. The air is thick with mosquitoes. Their shovels scrape against something that isn't rock or root. Abdication reaches into the wet earth and pulls out a small, dark object. It is a human skull, then another, and a third. They are not just skulls. They are the remains of children. In this cold, godless forest, Abdication and Ryabov have solved the most forbidden mystery of the Soviet state. They have found the lost Romanovs, and they are terrified. In 1979, the USSR is a fortress of secrets. To reveal this discovery is not to be a hero. It is to be an enemy of the state. It means prison, or worse. They have just made the discovery of the century, and now they must hide it. The two men take a few quick, grainy photographs. They pull 3 skulls from the mud for proof, and then they do the unthinkable. They bury the evidence all over again, smoothing the earth, praying no one ever finds out what they've done. They would have to guard this terrible secret for 12 more years, waiting for an entire empire to collapse before they could speak. This is not a story about an execution. This is the story of a 100-year investigation, a cold case that was solved not by police, but by the killers themselves. A perfect crime that unraveled piece by piece because its perpetrators were too proud to stay silent.
To understand what Abdication and Ryabov found in that forest, we must go back 61 years. We must go back to the events that led the imperial family of Russia to this remote corner of the Ural Mountains and to the house of one unlucky man. The year 1917 was a firestorm. The February Revolution had toppled a 300-year-old dynasty. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne, and suddenly the most powerful man in the world was a prisoner in his own palace. The family's first hope was exile. Their cousin, King George V of Great Britain, had offered them asylum, but the offer was quickly and quietly withdrawn. The British government, fearing a political backlash, turned its back on the Romanovs. The king chose to save his own crown rather than his cousin's life. The Romanovs were trapped. First, they were sent to Tobolsk, a remote town in the heart of Siberia, far from the revolutionary chaos in the capital. But in October 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. The civil war had begun, and the Romanovs were now valuable hostages. In April 1918, they were moved to the Bolshevik stronghold of Ekaterinburg, a city in the Ural Mountains. The local Ural Soviet needed a secure location to hold them. They found the perfect property, a large, modern stone house in the center of town. It belonged to Nikolai Nikolaevich Ipatiev. He was a successful military engineer. He had nothing to do with the revolution. He had bought the house just a few years earlier as a symbol of his success. In late April 1918, Bolshevik agents arrived at his door and gave him 48 hours to vacate. His home was being requisitioned. The agents gave it a new, chillingly bureaucratic name: the House of Special Purpose. This was not a home. It was a fortress. The Bolsheviks immediately erected a tall, double wooden fence, so high that the family could not see the street and no one could see in. The windows in their rooms were painted over with lime. Machine guns were placed on the roof. The group was now 11 people. There was Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their young, sickly son, Alexei. And then there were the 4 who stayed. They were 4 loyal attendants who had been given every opportunity to leave, but refused. Dr. Eugene Botkin, the court physician, was a man of deep principle. In his letters, he wrote that he could not abandon the family and that his sacred duty as a doctor required him to stay with the ailing Alexei. Anna Demidova was the Empress's parlor maid. She was a tall, gentle woman who had been with Alexandra for years and chose to follow her into imprisonment. And then there was Alexei Troop, the Tsar's personal valet, and Ivan Kharitonov, the family's cook. They were not royalty. They were ordinary people who chose loyalty over life. Life inside the house was a suffocating mix of boredom and dread. The family lived on meager soldiers' rations, often just bread and tea. The guards, mostly former factory workers, were hostile. They would scrawl crude drawings on the walls and sing revolutionary songs just to taunt the family.
In early July, a new commandant arrived to take control. His name was Yakov Yurovsky. He was a cold, methodical man, and with his arrival, the security became absolute. But life went on. The family tried to maintain a routine. Nicholas would read to his children. Alexandra and the girls would sew, mending their own clothes. It was during these quiet afternoons that they did something in secret. They took the family jewels, diamonds, emeralds, and rubies, and carefully sewed them into the linings of their corsets and undergarments. They were preparing for an escape, or perhaps a new life in exile. July 16, 1918, was a deceptively calm day. The family was allowed their usual brief walk in the small fenced-in garden. Yurovsky even brought in fresh eggs for Alexei. The false sense of calm was palpable. That evening, the family noticed a small, strange detail. Yurovsky entered and told them that the young kitchen boy, a 14-year-old named Leonid Sednev, was being temporarily removed to see his uncle. The Empress Alexandra was suspicious. In her final diary entry, she wrote, "He was taken away. We wonder if it is true, and if we shall see the boy again." They would not. Later that night, the family played a game of cards. Around 10:30 p.m., they went to bed. In her diary, Alexandra noted the weather. Her last written words were, 10:30, good weather, plus 15 degrees. While they slept, the final act was set in motion. The order was not given by one man, but by a committee. The Ural Soviet, the hardline local Bolshevik government, had been telegraphing Moscow for days. The White Army was only miles away. If the Tsar was rescued, it would be a devastating blow to the revolution. They needed permission. The permission came, but not on paper. Vladimir Lenin and his government in Moscow were masters of plausible deniability. There would be no signed order, no direct trace. The answer came back via a coded message,
understood by all. Moscow approves, but the Ural Soviet must take full public responsibility. The local committee didn't hesitate. They voted. The Romanov problem was to be solved that night. They tasked their most trusted operative with the execution, the commandant of the house himself, Yakov Yurovsky. He was a local man, a watchmaker by trade, and a fanatical Bolshevik. He was known for being ruthless, organized, and, most importantly, discreet. He was the perfect man to make the problem disappear. Downstairs, Yurovsky gathered his chosen squad. They debated how to do it. Some suggested grenades, but that would be too loud. Others suggested entering the bedrooms and using knives while they slept, but they feared a struggle. Finally, Yurovsky settled on a simple, cruel deception. He would wake them in the middle of the night and tell them there was fighting in the streets, an emergency. He would tell them for their own safety, they had to be moved to the basement.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, the house was quiet. Yakov Yurovsky descended the stairs to the rooms where the family's physician, Dr. Eugene Bodkin, was sleeping. He woke him gently. There was, Yurovsky said, an emergency. The anti-Bolshevik forces were attacking Yekaterinburg. The situation in the streets was chaotic. For the family's own safety, he explained, they had to be moved from the second floor to the basement immediately. He told Dr. Botkin to wake the rest of the family and tell them to dress quickly. There was no panic. The family had faced chaos before. They believed the lie. They spent nearly 45 minutes getting ready, dressing in their travel clothes. They were not just confused, they were calm, believing they were about to be evacuated from the city. They gathered their coats and hats. The Empress's maid, Anna Demidova, brought 2 small pillows. One of the young duchesses, Anastasia, brought her small dog, Jemmy. At 2:30 a.m., the procession began. Yakov Yurovsky led them down a narrow internal staircase into the semi-basement of the house. Nicholas II, the former emperor, walked ahead carrying his 13-year-old son, Alexei, who could not walk on his own. Alexandra followed, then the 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their 4 royal attendants. They were led into a small empty room at the corner of the basement. The furniture had all been removed. The family was confused. If this was an evacuation, where were the carriages? Seeing the empty room, the Empress Alexandra turned to Yurovsky. "What?" she asked with surprise. "Are there no chairs? Can't we sit?" Yurovsky, playing his part, nodded and ordered 2 chairs to be brought in. One was given to the Empress. The other was given to the young Tsarevich Alexei. The rest of the family and their attendants lined up along the back wall, still holding their pillows and purses, patiently waiting for instructions. A moment later, the door opened again. Yurovsky entered, followed by a squad of armed men. They filed into the small room, filling the doorway. The family began to grow visibly uneasy. This was not an evacuation. Yurovsky stepped forward. He pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and began to read a prepared statement.
"In view of the fact," he read, his voice flat, "that your relatives in Europe are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you." The statement was so sudden, so bureaucratic, that Nicholas didn't understand. He turned to Yurovsky, bewildered. "What?" he asked. "What?" Yurovsky repeated the sentence. The Empress, Alexandra, and her daughter Olga tried to make the sign of the cross. Nicholas turned back to his family. his face frozen in disbelief. Yurovsky immediately raised his pistol and fired. Instantly, the other men opened fire as well. The tiny room, just 16 by 18 feet, exploded in a chaotic, deafening volley of gunfire. Smoke from the gunpowder completely filled the air, making it impossible to see or breathe. The sound was overwhelming. The shooting lasted for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. Then silence. But as the thick smoke began to clear, the killers were met with a horrific sight. Not all of the victims had perished. The young Tsarevich Alexei was still alive, as were several of his sisters. In the haze, the men saw something inexplicable. Their bullets were bouncing off the young women's clothing with strange, sparking sounds, as if they were wearing armor. The men, whom were now terrified by what they were seeing, were in a state of panic. The execution had been a failure. The family, fearing for their lives and their wealth, had done something in secret. For months, they had been sewing the family jewels, diamonds, emeralds, and rubies into the linings of their corsets and undergarments. This secret, meant to be their salvation and their bank account in exile, had become their final curse. The diamond-laced corsets had acted as primitive but effective bulletproof vests, deflecting the bullets and turning their final moments into an agonizing ordeal. The killers, now desperate to finish the job, were forced to use other weapons. The chaotic event finally came to an end. Even Anastasia's small dog was not spared. By 3 a.m., nearly 30 minutes after it began, all 11 people in the room were silent. The walls and floor were a testament to the chaotic failure. The first and most brutal part of the night was over. But for Yakov Yurovsky, the true ordeal had just begun. He now had 11 victims in his basement, and his next task was to make them disappear.
The plan, if one existed, began to fall apart immediately. Yakov Yurovsky's first challenge was to move the victims out of the house without alerting the town. A single truck, a Fiat, had been ordered to arrive at midnight, but it was late. It only arrived at 1:30 a.m. and was left running outside the Ipatiev House, its engine noise meant to muffle the sounds from the basement. Now, at 3 a.m., the truck was finally put to use. The victims were brought up from the basement on improvised stretchers and loaded into the back. The scene was grim and disorganized. As the bodies were being moved, some of the guards, who had been drinking heavily, began to search them for valuables. They ripped at rings and bracelets. Yurovsky, a strict disciplinarian, was furious. He stopped the looting immediately, threatening to shoot anyone who took anything. He collected the stolen items, but this was a clear sign. He was losing control of his own men. Around 3:30 a.m., the truck, loaded with its terrible cargo and covered by a canvas, finally rumbled away from the Ipatiev House. It headed northwest, toward a remote area of forest outside the city. The destination was a place called Ganya Yama, or Ganya's Pit, a collection of abandoned iron ore mines. Yurovsky had been assured by Peter Ermakov, the military commissar in charge of the disposal, that a perfect, deep mine shaft had been chosen to hide the bodies forever. He had been lied to. When the truck arrived at the site, it was met by a large group of men, local workers and Red Guards who had been gathered by Ermakov. They were drunk and they were angry. They had been told they would be the ones to execute the Tsar, and they were furious to find their prize had been taken from them. They had no shovels, no tools, and no plan. Worse,
The truck immediately got stuck in the thick, boggy mud of the forest road. Yurovsky's carefully planned secret operation had devolved into a chaotic, drunken mob scene in the middle of a forest. As dawn began to break, he was in a panic. He ordered the bodies to be transferred to smaller horse-drawn carts that could navigate the mud. When they finally reached the chosen mine shaft, known as Shaft Number 7, Yurovsky's heart sunk. It was not the deep, flooded cavern he had been promised. It was a shallow pit, and the water at the bottom was only a few feet deep. In desperation, he ordered the men to throw hand grenades down the shaft, hoping the explosions would collapse the mine walls and bury the evidence. The grenades exploded, but they did little more than further damage the victims and churn the water. The plan was a catastrophic failure.
It was now broad daylight. The entire operation had been seen by peasants in nearby villages who had heard the truck, the shouting, and the explosions. Yurovsky posted guards around the pit and rode back to Yekaterinburg, furious. He knew this was not a burial. It was a neon sign pointing directly to the crime. For nearly 2 days, the victims lay in that shallow pit while Yurovsky scrambled for a new plan. He realized he couldn't trust anyone, especially not the incompetent Yermakov. On the night of July 18th, Yurovsky returned, this time with a smaller, more loyal team. They endured the grim task of pulling the victims back out of the mine shaft. He had a new destination, a deep, abandoned copper mine he had been told about, further down the Koptiaki road. But fate intervened again. His truck, carrying the victims, got stuck in the mud a second time, this time in a lowland area known as Porosink Log, or Pig's Meadow. It was almost dawn. The truck's wheels spun uselessly. Yurovsky was out of time. He knew he would never make it to the copper mines. He looked around. This was it. This miserable, muddy clearing would have to be the final resting place. He made a desperate new decision. He would have to divide the evidence. This was the one brilliant move in an otherwise failed operation. He reasoned that if any investigators found a grave, they would count the bodies. If the number wasn't 11, they would never be certain it was the Romanovs. Yurovsky ordered 2 of the victims, who we now know were the young Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, Maria, to be taken a short distance away. There, in a separate clearing, he ordered a fire to be built. But a bonfire in a wet forest is not a crematorium. After hours of slow, smoky work, the bodies were charred but not destroyed. For the other 9 victims, he ordered his men to dig a shallow pit directly in the middle of the muddy road. He had brought barrels of sulfuric acid, which he poured over the victims to obscure their identities. The pit was dug, the 9 victims were placed inside, and the hole was covered. To complete the deception, Yurovsky had his men lay down a set of wooden railroad ties over the spot and drive the truck back and forth, packing the earth flat, turning a grave into a simple, unremarkable stretch of road. At 6 a.m. on July 19th, nearly 48 hours after the execution began, Yakov Yurovsky finally drove away. He was exhausted but satisfied. He had failed twice, but this final, desperate plan, he believed, was a success. He had separated the victims, he had obscured their identities, and he had hidden them under a road that would be used every day. He believed, with certainty, that no one would ever find them.
Yakov Yurovsky's secret was safe. The bodies were hidden under a road, fragmented and doused in acid. The case, he believed, was closed. But a secret is only powerful if someone knows you have it. For Yurovsky and the other killers,
The execution of the Tsar was not just a grim duty, it was the defining moment of their lives. And in the years that followed, they found it impossible to stay silent. Their pride, their guilt, and their desire to secure their own place in history created a trail of evidence that would one day lead directly to that muddy road. The killers were not a monolith. They were three distinct men, and their confessions were driven by three distinct motives. One by bureaucracy, one by pride, and one by legacy. The first and most important was Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant. Who was he? Yurovsky was not a soldier or a born killer. He was a watchmaker from Ekaterinburg, a man of precision, patience, and technical skill. He was also a fanatical, cold-blooded Bolshevik, a man who believed the revolution was a science. He was chosen to lead the execution precisely because he was not a chaotic drunk like the others. He was seen as a discreet operative who could be trusted to handle a sensitive liquidation. His confession was just like him, cold, precise, and bureaucratic. In 1920, just 2 years after the event, Yurovsky was asked by party historians to write a definitive account of the last days of the former Tsar. He was not writing a confession. He was writing a technical report for the special file, a document that would be read only by the party elite. He wrote it with the pride of a project manager who had overcome terrible obstacles. He detailed the family's final days, the selection of the basement room, and most critically, the chaotic failure of the first burial at Ganina Yama, placing the blame squarely on the incompetence of the other man, Peter Ermakov. And then he described his own success, the final, secret burial at Pig's Meadow. He described hiding the 9 bodies under the railroad ties. He described separating the other 2 victims. Most importantly, he drew a map. He gave precise navigational directions to the grave. He wrote, "The grave is at the 184th verst post, 100 sajans, about 700 feet from the railway crossing." Yurovsky believed he was sealing the event for history. What he was really doing was creating a treasure map for future investigators. His secret note was filed away, buried deep in the party archives, and promptly classified. The second killer was Yurovsky's total opposite. This was Peter Ermakov, the military commissar of Verk Isikt.
Yermakov was not a professional. He was a revolutionary brawler. He craved glory. He was the man who had gathered the drunken, angry workers at Ganina Yama, promising them a chance to participate. He was disorganized, violent, and loud. And he was furious that Yermakov had stolen his spotlight. While Yermakov hid his story in a secret file, Yermakov took it to the stage. In the 1930s, as Stalin's industrialization swept the Urals, Yermakov became a local celebrity. He would give public lectures at factories and party clubs. His most popular lecture was titled, "How We Shot the Tsar." Imagine the scene, a packed hall of workers and Yermakov on stage reenacting the event. He would pull out his own Mauser pistol, wave it in the air, and proudly declare that he, Peter Yermakov, had fired the shot that killed the last emperor. It was a lie, but his pride was so great that in 1936 he donated his historic Mauser pistol to the local museum in Sverdlovsk, where it was put on display as a revolutionary relic. Decades later, ballistic analysis would prove the pistol was the wrong caliber. He was a fraud, a braggart, but his boasting ensured the story never died. As the years passed, the original participants began to die off. By the 1960s, the Soviet state now under Khrushchev, realized it was losing its old Bolsheviks. A project was started to record their memoirs for the state radio archives. This brings us to the third killer, Mikhail Medvedev. Medvedev was a key member of the local Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police. He was one of the men in the room, and he had a very different story to tell. In 1964, now an old man in his 70s, he was invited to a Moscow recording studio to leave his testimony for posterity. The tapes he left behind are an audio chronicle from a nightmare. On the recording, his voice is old but clear, and he directly contradicts Yurikov's account. Yurikov wanted to read some paper, but I had already pulled the trigger of my Browning and fired the first bullet into the Tsar. Two men, Yurikov and Medvedev, both claiming the honor of the first shot. In the same oral history project, another participant, Isai Redzinski, recorded his own memories. He confirms the total chaos of the event. It was so unorganized, his voice crackles. We almost shot each other with ricocheting bullets. By 1970, all the killers were dead, but they had left a perfectly preserved trail of evidence, each according to his own ego. One left a secret map, buried in a party file. One left a fake murder weapon, displayed in a museum. And one left his own voice preserved on magnetic tape. All the pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered across the Soviet state, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to put them together.
The clues lay dormant for decades, buried in state-controlled archives. The party believed they were secure, but a new generation of Soviet citizens had developed a unique obsession. They were red detectives, amateur historians dedicated to piecing together the hidden, forbidden stories of the revolution. And the greatest hidden story of all was the fate of the Romanovs. Two of these detectives were the men from our opening: Alexander Abdication, the Sverdlovsk geologist, and Gely Ryabov, the Moscow filmmaker. They were a perfect team. Abdication was the local man, a quiet scientist who knew the geography of the Urals and had been obsessed with the Romanov case since his youth. Ryabov was the insider, a well-regarded artist and writer. Crucially, Ryabov was also an advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs, a position that gave him an almost unheard-of level of access to these special files no one else could see. In the mid-1970s, Ryabov, using his official credentials, began his secret quest. He sifted through the audio recordings. He studied the memoirs. He read the contradictory accounts of Romakov and Medvedev. And then, in a dusty party archive, he found it: Yakov Yurovsky's secret 1920 note. For Ryabov, it was a revelation. It wasn't just a confession, it was a map. He carefully copied Yurovsky's directions. He now knew, unlike anyone else, that the official story of Ganinayama was a lie. He knew the bodies had been moved. And he knew Yurovsky's description of Pig's Meadow was the key. He flew to Sverdlovsk and secretly met with Abdication. For Abdication, this was the missing piece. He spent the next year poring over old pre-revolutionary maps of the Kaptyaki Road, cross-referencing them with Yurovsky's 60-year-old clues. He pinpointed a small, unremarkable stretch of boggy lowland. On May 30th, 1979, the two men drove out to the site. They were operating in total secrecy. This was not a sanctioned excavation. It was a deeply subversive act. They followed Yurovsky's map, 100 sajans from the railroad crossing. They found the exact spot. The ground was soft and marshy, just as Yurovsky had described. They began to dig. At first, they found nothing but mud and rock. Then, their shovels hit something hard, the rotted wood of railroad ties, buried exactly where Yurovsky said they would be. They dug underneath them, and they found the grave.
The moment from the hook had arrived. They uncovered the skulls, greened with copper from the bullets, and the tangled mass of 9 skeletons. The realization was overwhelming. This was not a theory. This was the truth. But this was 1979. The Soviet Union was ruled by Leonid Brezhnev. The country was in an era of stagnation, and the KGB was all-powerful. This discovery was a political atom bomb. It proved that the state's founding fathers were not just revolutionaries, but disorganized killers. It was a secret the state had spent 60 years burying. Avdonin and Ryabov made the only decision they could. They photographed the scene. They took 3 of the skulls as proof. One would be sent for testing. The others they would hide. And then they reburied the Romanovs, hiding them once more. Ryabov returned to Moscow with the skulls. Avdonin stayed in Sverdlovsk, guarding the secret. For 12 long, agonizing years, they waited. Their moment finally came in 1991. The Soviet Union was in its death throes. Glasnost, or openness, had swept the nation. Old secrets were being exposed every day. In July 1991, Avdonin and Ryabov went public. They announced their discovery to the world. The new government, under Boris Yeltsin, the very man who had destroyed the Ipatiev House, had no choice. An official investigation was opened. The authorities went to Pig's Meadow, with Avdonin guiding them. The official excavation began, and just as Avdonin and Ryabov had said, they found the shallow grave under the road. They exhumed the remains of 9 people. The discovery was a global sensation, but it also created a brand new mystery. Yurovsky's note was proven true. The 9 bodies were there, but the note also said he had separated 2 victims from the main grave, and the 1991 excavation confirmed it. There were only 9 bodies. The Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, Maria, were missing. This single fact, the 2 missing bodies, would ignite a firestorm of conspiracy theories and resurrect the most enduring myth of the 20th century. The 1991 excavation at Pig's Meadow had solved one mystery, but created another. The world now had 9 bodies, but there were 11 victims. The absence of Alexei and Maria provided rocket fuel to a myth that had haunted the world for 70 years. The myth was Anastasia. Almost immediately after the executions, rumors began to spread that the youngest daughter, Anastasia, had miraculously survived. This was fueled by the chaos of the event and the Bolsheviks' own disinformation. For years, they only officially announced the death of Nicholas II, keeping the fate of his family a deliberate, confusing secret. This ambiguity allowed dozens of imposters to emerge, but one was different. Her name was Anna Anderson. She appeared in Germany in the 1920s after a suicide attempt. She claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia. She was convincing. She seemed to know intimate details of court life, and some relatives and former servants of the Romanovs actually believed her. For decades, her claim was hotly debated, becoming the subject of books, plays, and movies. She carried herself with a tragic royal air, and she fought a legal battle for recognition for most of her life.
The 1991 discovery, however, provided a new powerful tool to test her claim: DNA. The investigation, now an official state matter, became one of the most complex forensic cases in history. The 9 skeletons were fragmented and badly damaged by acid and time, but scientists were confident they could extract a genetic profile. First, they needed to identify the Empress Alexandra. Her lineage was well documented. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. Investigators reached out to the British royal family and received a blood sample from Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. His maternal grandmother was Princess Victoria of Hesse, Alexandra's older sister. The test was a perfect match. The mitochondrial DNA from one of the female skeletons, passed down through the female line, was a perfect match to Prince Philip's. They had found the Empress. Next, they had to identify the Tsar. This was more difficult. They needed DNA from a close relative in the male line. Investigators took a daring step. They received permission to exhume the body of Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke Georgy, who had died in 1999. The comparison was another perfect match. Not only did the DNA align, but both Nicholas and his brother shared an extremely rare genetic mutation, known as heteroplasmy. This tiny quirk in the DNA was so unusual that the odds of it being a coincidence were practically zero. They had found the Tsar. With the parents' DNA confirmed, the children were easily identified as their offspring. The remains of Dr. Botkin, the valet Trapp, the cook Karitonov, and the maid Demidova were identified by skeletal analysis and, in some cases, by matching them to their descendants. Now, the scientists could finally settle the Anna Anderson case. Anderson had died in 1984, but a sample of her tissue had been preserved from a medical procedure. They tested her DNA against the new confirmed Romanov profiles.
The results were definitive. She was not a Romanov. There was no match. The 70-year-old myth was officially over. Further tests revealed her DNA was a match for the descendants of a missing Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska. Anastasia did not survive. But this scientific triumph only highlighted the remaining question. The DNA proved who was in the grave, but what about the 2 who were not? The answer, once again, was found in the killer's own words. Investigators went back to Yakov Yurovsky's 1920 note. He had been explicit. We burned 2 bodies, those of Alexei and, apparently, Demidova. He was wrong about the maid, Demidova, but right about the process. He described a separate fire, away from the main grave, near the place where we planned to bury them. For years, local historians and amateur archaeologists searched Pig's Meadow, looking for that second site. In the summer of 2007, a group of local enthusiasts, led by researcher Sergei Pogorelov, decided to re-examine the area. They used Jurovsky's notes and modern archaeological probes. They decided to investigate a small, unassuming clearing just 70 meters from the main grave. It was a spot that had been overlooked. They found an area that had clearly been subjected to an intense fire. They began to dig. What they found were not skeletons. They found 44 small charred bone fragments and several human teeth. They found bullet fragments and pieces of a ceramic container, the kind used to hold sulfuric acid. This was not a burial. It was the remnants of a desperate, fiery attempt to destroy evidence. The fragments were rushed to genetic testing labs in Russia and the United States. The most advanced DNA technology in the world was brought to bear on these tiny pieces of bone. The results were conclusive.
The DNA from the fragments belonged to two individuals. One was a female with DNA matching the empress and the other sisters. The other was a male with DNA matching the Tsar and sharing the same rare heteroplasmy mutation. Furthermore, the male DNA showed the genetic marker for hemophilia, the royal disease they knew had been passed from Queen Victoria through Alexandra to her son. This was it. They had found Alexei and Maria. Yurovsky's note was proven true down to the last grim detail. He had separated the bodies to confuse any future investigators, a tactic that had, in fact, worked for 89 years. The science was now undeniable. All 11 victims had been found and identified. The century-old cold case was scientifically closed.
With the scientific evidence now complete, all that remained was to close the file. But in Russia, the Romanov case has always been more than a simple criminal investigation. It is a story about faith, politics, and national memory. And for one of those institutions, the case was not closed. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had canonized the Romanovs as saints in the year 2000, remained skeptical. Church leaders had been burned by decades of Soviet lies and disinformation. They were wary of the new state's rapid conclusions in the 1990s. They questioned the DNA evidence and the motives of the investigators. For years, the church refused to formally recognize the remains. This created a painful stalemate. The identified, authenticated remains of Tsarevich Alexei and his sister Maria, discovered in 2007, could not be buried with their family. For over a decade, they were stored in cardboard boxes on a shelf in the Russian State Archive. This dispute forced the Russian government to keep the investigation open. In 2015, the Investigative Committee, Russia's equivalent of the FBI, reopened the case for one final, definitive review. This time, their goal was to satisfy every possible doubt. The investigation was monumental. They conducted more than 40 new, complex expert analyses. They re-exhumed the remains of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra from their tomb in St. Petersburg. They even exhumed Nicholas's father, Tsar Alexander III, from his tomb to conduct a new father-to-son DNA comparison. They tested the bloodstains on the shirt Nicholas wore during an assassination attempt in Japan in 1891. They compared DNA from the skeletons to living descendants of the Romanov family, creating an unassailable genetic map. Every single test, from every conceivable angle, confirmed the original findings. The evidence was, and is, overwhelming. Finally, in 2022, the state officially declared the case closed. The investigation, which had spanned 104 years, was complete. The remains were all authentic. But what of the building where the crime took place?
The Ipatiev House, the house of special purpose, had its own strange fate. After the White Army took Ekaterinburg in 1918, it became a site of pilgrimage. Investigators documented the bullet holes and grim evidence in the basement. When the Bolsheviks retook the city, they turned it into a museum of atheism. But over the decades, the dark, brooding house became a problem. It was a morbid landmark.
People, both locals and foreign tourists, would come to stare at it. It became a silent, unofficial monument to the murdered family. In 1977, the Politburo in Moscow, led by Yuri Andropov, decided this silent monument was a political liability. They issued a secret order: destroy the house. The man tasked with carrying out this demolition was the local Sverdlovsk party boss. His name was Boris Yeltsin. In the middle of the night, Yeltsin ordered bulldozers to move in. By morning, the Ipatiev House was a pile of rubble. The state had tried, once again, to erase the memory of its crime. But history, like the bodies in the forest, refused to stay buried. Today, Boris Yeltsin is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. And on the exact spot where the Ipatiev House once stood, a massive new cathedral has been built, the Church on the Blood, in honor of all saints resplendent in the Russian land. It is one of the largest and most visited pilgrimage sites in Russia. The story of the Romanovs began as a failed execution. It became a failed cover-up. And finally, it became a 100-year-long cold case. It is a case that was only solved because its perpetrators, proud of their perfect crime, left a trail of clues: a boastful lecture, a gun in a museum, classified audio recordings, and a single secret note. Yakov Yurovsky, the man who designed the cover-up, also designed its unraveling. He thought he was writing a secret report for the archives. He ended up writing the map that would lead the world 60 years later directly to his victim's grave.